has completed the 10 stages achieving the highest perfection of Bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning. O Manjushri, all-loving one, with the brilliance of your wisdom, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind and lighten my wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the text that explain them. Saji Pakishu Shinvito Rivati Sangeshi Shinvito Rokunam Lakshmi Pasha Pasho Ira
Sangye Chelo Sobi Shanamba Chanchi Patu Tsuji Ravi Chushi Rolam Beje Sangye Chupasho Sangye Chelo Sobi Shanamba Chanchi Patu Tsuji Ravi Chushi Sangye Rolam Beje Sangye Chupasho Sangye Chelo Sobi Shanamba Chanchi Patu Tsuji Ravi Chushi Rolam Beje Sangye Chupasho Kanki Tudini Zone, Bawa Tamse Pambuche, Pambuchun Dunze, Kodum Kela Changse no. Good morning.
Oh, so the camera is off again. Maybe. Okay. No. All right. That's okay. Okay.
The Kazi the person in Makashiti and Jaurun Sunjishu, Samalo, Kibu, and Chui Revoyes.
So we had a few days in between the previous week's teaching and this week. And during that time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave teachings. Geshe is hoping that all of you have enjoyed it.
Terdinza and Jaurumchigi. That's Junju, the kitchen was shoot in the songs, and the Junju kitchen, but Dinami Lew Trupatan, Lew Gabaniti, and the shoot kitchen chagdos, in this song, that number in the same year was. In the Danganzo Kaboki, Junju level, and the true way tolerance and level true way, and it Judin Imbutini, control ye, Candace never give do, and it control Candace Pango do, Dingy called the red was right.
And during His Holiness's teaching, he spoke of the importance of studying Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life, and particularly emphasized the importance of Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 of this manual. So you've listened to those teachings, you've probably heard His Holiness referencing those chapters in his teachings, and we're currently looking at the 6th chapter. So studying the 6th chapter, we get to look at the ways in which anger causes us harm, and also the ways of abandoning anger.
These are level to buy a coach, seek to buy enough, and it's control Sasa Manor Vajilia, Kezi control Sagu Yavana, and it control Sasa Manor Vajilia, control Satuyak, Magas Chekwa Satilia, magasa che tuyach ani odinji chagdos mado nganzu mombo mari bigi shawon di kyoni ani chi chadang kondri shawon di kyobana ani kondrosa mugosada ani kondrosa nodroya soba odinji chabana ani ram magiba mado ani pendo chi emyabadi ani chonju lew truwe nanglo yata tagwacheni sungdos ra.
And if we study well this material, the one that is taught by chapter number 6, then we'd be able to become angry at something that is not mistaken. If there's something that we are going to get angry with, if there's something that we should dislike, we want it to be unmistaken. But currently, because of ignorance, being under the control of ignorance, and because we are under the control of ignorance, then anger also arises in an uncontrollable way. We get angry at something and we are mistaken with respect to what we are angry with. We dislike something, we are mistaken with respect to what we dislike. We act in a certain way because we are under the control of ignorance, and because we have no control, we go wrong. And because of that, our mind is made unhappy. And whatever we do under that state of mind is not right.
Telediza kanji kondro di yakbu chika matubaina ani da sobi nyamne sedi kyoni ta chiktasan desame ju chikchadu dos soba yabu jimebaina ani ninji dan ani chanju ku semsing di da yongya koram dos ro odinza ani chonju di kige ta so ani chanju sem nyamsin le sur 태양 자와 인지 실샤고 돈이 잔주 생명수님 르마디 아니 전주니다 믹스칸 송고야자 또 기침부 쇼지레스 자워르치 도도 직 디송송스라.
And currently we are unable to arrest anger. And if we're unable to arrest anger, our practice of patience will not result well. It will not go well. So what we train it in general is bodhicitta and the trainings. And particularly here, when we look at this text, at the very root, what we are taking up is the stages of developing bodhicitta. And for that reason, His Holiness emphasized the importance of this manual in terms of making sure that we are developing the trainings properly.
데레다 디니 내가 찍려야 아니 동반이 된디 그지 아니 셔럽 차티 아니 쇼지 개침부친다 가지 송약 조디야 안지 오만주버리 반den다오 타비 송 오만주버 데는 장관을 선거와 주송 아니 장인 렉시님보 딩이기 다직 조시 님보디 돈이도 비셔럽 차고레스 간지 유tom바니 기 네루 텔렌페비 리비 랑 토니 tom바니 토비 이시디 아니 소 차고레스 진짜 어디 디콜 아니 지당이기 슈고마르다 가지 십십 차와지 아니 겨울문치 송송스 진짜 더 딩이 송드레 토니 아니 냠슬랭 거야지 원의 찾는 넘버 3기 위치 하도기 대버 준비 위치디 아니 저거 찬주고 셈다 따와 동반이 또비 셔름님 버텔이야 투데요거디 아니 세우 진 송에서 안간주다 윤댕기다 냠랭기 쪼디 디케 거야다 어딘지 차기도 왔어.
So in order to do that, one point that we develop is the wisdom of emptiness. We approach that from the side of wisdom. And in the teaching that His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave previously, he spoke of Chandakirti's supplement to the Middle Way and Lama Tsongkhapa's essence of eloquence. In drawing from those teachings, His Holiness precisely spoke of how we develop the reason that determines the wisdom of emptiness. So that's the topic. This is the subject matter of these two treatises, the Supplement to the Middle Way and Lama Tsongkhapa's Essence of Eloquence, are focusing on the side of wisdom and how to develop the reasoning in order to determine this aspect of wisdom. So His Holiness gave precise teaching of these two manuals. And for us as practitioners of the Dhamma in general, but even more so practitioners of the Mahayana Dhamma, it's important that we develop those two sides, combine them together. So we have the side of wisdom that realizes emptiness, and the method side of bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, which what we want to regularly, continuously carry into our practice.
Tajidan Hingaras Kazita, Pandin Dawatabi, so Omanjubata, Omanjubi Randel T, and Jaurumchigita, Nimatalpa, Sirius, the Nin Talbalia, and if Mundichisian Alalia, Nimataba, Omanjubi Randel, Tadigis, and the young Sungudos, and it's Kanji Lord Dinamalia. It's a danganzle, king, but could not see one chair the ina. And it king lamb to long dodge. And it Yashujilia, Jaurmuchi, Sonchi, Yani and any Shiago, Kokovich, Toguras, in the Dinalalia, Katuina. Pesci and it Dawakashi Nalale, Jaurmuchi, Sonju, Sarsinanga Duchi Nalale. And Tagpa in the Omanjubata. Omanjubi Randre thingy, and the job on the shots in Nimatava serious. And the Sonju Kadisonaya, Nintava, this song songs, in the D. Karsongo is lonely. Kitchishu Yimbachi Kadu in a Tagoyadi, Omanjuba, Omanjubi Randre, the Chagadus, Tikogoras, Tanganzola, Tikogoras.
So we are familiar with those texts in the sense that we've heard about Chandrakirti's Supplement to the Middle Way and also Clear Words, the other commentary that he composed based upon the Supplement to the Middle Way. And His Holiness mentioned in his teachings that daily he continues to read through those texts again and again. He does that continuously and daily. So this year, we are affected by this adverse condition of COVID-19. Now, we also have an opportunity to take adverse conditions onto the path. For example, because of this pandemic, we have now opportunities to regularly listen to teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that he also continuously, again and again, reads through Chandrakirti's Supplement and the other commentary. So the texts are always on his table or desk, and he reads through different sections on a daily basis. So in thinking of what His Holiness is saying, what is indicating, he's indicating the importance of the study of these two treatises. This is what we need to understand. We need to understand the importance, the significance of what His Holiness is indicating to us in relation to the importance of these two texts.
And the social and chosen to so lenchini and the chivius, the Dimatin Sawin, Dimatin Sawini, and the Yawnji Common Tungmunda, some rich, so the Levitoni, and the chivius, Mash Yundini, and the chick, Nanem Dragri, and the Pendru Sodi, and the chick, kitchen was showing but, on the Lawloni changing when the kitchen was showing but, Son Devati, and the Yawnji. 가서다 징미님이 토니 and those song dige and ratrepatoch canansoin semya ratretuyadoch and chagdos ra di sosoro gaube chonsons the tamushevana
Jimmy Nimasa?
yanja.
For those of you who've listened to His Holiness's teaching, you know the things that His Holiness is saying always, what he's constantly repeating. So it's important to pay attention to that and to consider that well. If we consider what His Holiness has been emphasizing, we will certainly see the purpose of studying this material. Otherwise, if we don't really consider the message that His Holiness is putting across, we will be disregarding what is telling us. So he's been telling us to study this topic, but also in general, when he emphasizes the teachings, the manuals that came from the 17 Pandits of Nalanda as students, as those who endeavor to study the teachings that came from the Buddha and the treatises, is showing us what we need to focus on in our study. So then, considering what His Holiness is telling us, if you do have a sense of regard to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, then Geshe says that at least at home, he's pulling out the text, right? Pulling out the text, placing it on his desk, in his table. If His Holiness is emphasizing the importance of studying this text, then we should take that into consideration.
Adini dirisra inaya tanganzi shonduso chakpupe and jachimpu things of shoot sondi Gonzalea Chabu Chagoresta, Chabu Chagordania, Chabu do some you shavana, and then Lelha Jilea Figi Chigorata, and a Savigita let Tamboa, but let Tamboina, that took out Yomari Mato, and she Loshinanga to Dungi Jagolea, Nanshi, the Kanakans, Jamba Young in Chimbana, never do any shown chetosleya, Sigway, Pemasiva, Nanga Chagdas. I could begin a Chetangi Machi and Geshe sort of Labjat sort of Janjang, Chilaya, go for Dedavina, and it Tsugi, and it Tunjidia, Chinjun's motto, Mabadi, and could Gillet and Hakoros, Kazusi Piglayach, and it Nenga Chimbuta, and Shon Chaksa di Chakbu imba the Junzen Karsna, Nenga Chimbu sondi, Chakbu Chagores. Nenga chinju songwen lela chagors diko rodanres dinza nenga che songsha ju tole tu zutani ani yani yandu sewaina jonju nangala ya komna lawa minju ngut kan yoman sedi gomo dagaran chagors ro.
And when you undertake the study of these manuals, you can see how complicated they are. They are complicated because they're extensive and also profound. So it's not easy to study these manuals. They are complicated. But if you think that that's way too complicated, I can't really do it, and you set it aside, you will not be able to make a great progress. So if you're a beginner and you're just approaching the Buddha Dhamma, you might, for the time being, not look at those systems that are really complicated. But if you have been studying the Dhamma for 5, 6 or more years, but you still continue to neglect those systems that contain also teachings that are more complicated, you'll be left behind. In general, if you just attain general teachings or some general advice, and this is the only teachings that you get, you limit yourself in terms of the ability to make a greater progress. When you look at the great philosophical systems, the great philosophical systems, the great texts contain significant points, great points. And if it is a great and significant point, inevitably it might be more complicated to understand. Whereas if there's something that is just very simple, very easy to get, it is likely also to be also not that great, right? Not too important. So it's important to also look at our approach with respect to this text, which we find sometimes complicated. At some point, we should not shy away from those texts. Just as Shantideva says in this chapter, there's nothing whatsoever that does not become easier through familiarity.
Dini jerum jig song, the jina jarum jig kadu song junanaya, and jerum jig tavi korki, and song to so yan yand, and longden nangadas, ra tavi tavi namsha tena pewondi, tombani kolia song di, and jig kong to say yanamenadi, gyagal pendru so, that jig jumped the shumogachi, and dijenju gyagal pendru. Nanandagi tachi ani kebatso ani chik pyo kanjen jongi chedan riks manchi kyo tamba dinan ta jangwala musuga chimula ya so kontu nancheni kontu sagi long tu zuma down so ani tawi lekshi chimu nga sejer du so so chin danang dos ro.
When you look at Lama Tsongkhapa's texts, which teach the profound view, you see that the way that Lama Tsongkhapa teaches that is embedded with providing quotations from scriptures. So, for example, he would present a certain point with respect to emptiness, and then it will align together with that the scriptural sources that he used in order to determine the position that he put forward. So he draws not only from the text of Chandrakirtis, but also in general in his compositions from the text of the 17 Pandits of Nalanda. This is also, when you look at the text of the Pandits of Nalanda, you can see that this is also the way that they have composed the text and drawing from different sources. This is also the way that great beings, great masters of the past in Tibet have composed these texts. And particularly when you look at the text that Lama Tsongkhapa composed, he has 5 compositions that are dedicated for the view. And he presents the view together with scriptural citation in order to prove that they have a source.
The Lexi Nimbo said, Lexi Nimbo, Changi Lexi Nimbo, Kazu Sonju Nyayaka, Shonti, Tselaya, and Changi. Changwa da ngebi te ni ani pi tachi ani ni ten de ani lebar shibige ani jangola mo sunga bachim song nangi tachi nimbo tabati nim tabati ani tanglesi ni chagores ro chagores tinza tsendi tyandan tumbi tsendi tonda an kaza sonju naros.
The teaching that His Holiness gave just a couple of days ago were on essence of eloquence. Now, the full name of the text is Essence of Eloquence, distinguishing the provisional from the definitive. Which means that in this text, Lama Tsongkhapa compared the definitive and provisional in relation to points pertaining to the view and gave an essential explanation of these points, which means I extracted the essence of that, of distinguishing between what is provisional and what is definitive.
Tadirdi Nanzukabogi Zinjadan Diamundu Masan Roch, Kansan Kazimon, Chiag, Senyovenza, T. Tolia, Manjadu Tachidan Chimajin Kiri, Manking is in the Yavana, this Nimbi Javana, and it Tatach, Jawamuchita, Sonju Toton, Dinandu, Samsochi, Susi Samlia, Nyayach, Yungros, this Samni, Nimbi Shugoyadoch, Shiag Kolondo Deans Ra.
Now, you might be thinking, what are we talking about? How is it related to what we study here? It has no bearing whatsoever. Don't think about it like that. If you think about the teachings of His Holiness, you can also see how they're also related to what we study here. And Geshe thought of mentioning that in order to add, in order to supplement what we're studying here. So if you think carefully about what His Holiness says, you can say that you can add those teachings also to what we study here.
Tinza dandadi tangi leshi nimbu tsen korang toni leshi nimbu gi joshi gi nimbu di tsen korang ton dengu yores ro ani changi islaundi changi tenda nibi tenset tela kogo wores.
Essence of eloquence, you can also call that essence of good explanation. And essence of good explanation in some sense indicates the import of this text. What is that essence of good explanation? It is the excellence of explanation that distinguishes between what is provisional and what is definitive.
Tere an sinza ani changi tenset manzo ya nawa tar ani nawa tar madribi gi chödi gi chödele ya changden se wores. Nawa tar mewa inza ani nawa tar ani madruba ani komba shendul jer go chagonza ani changden se wores. Ngeden sla undi nani mentumba mahimba nani tumba ani chön namgi nelim teleya ani ngeden se gyores. Ta dingi gi tendi chigla chigden chin rogoros. Inza di gi te ani matra undi gi ani sanji chomden digi do nanglo ya ani dushi kamda mebala teni rimba ma song yuenza ani song gashi ani tandon de jego ya song gashi ngeden imba tengo ya tinti gi ani yawa inza di sebo chinda ani jangon ongsunga bachimbi ani ripi lam tonima so di sanji chomden digi ta song shijabe toni ani ripi lam ten ani 지 가진 디나 용하나 신기 다 텐들기 리베톤 텐종기 리베톤이 아니 장이 켜버다 세우 진 송여인자 아니 레시니 보세티 차버레스로.
And as we distinguish between the provisional and the definitive, well, what is the provisional meaning? What is provisional is that which doesn't exist in the way that it appears. Since it doesn't exist in the way that it appears, it is provisional, which means that it needs to be explained using another meaning, an alternative meaning. That is what is provisional. What is definitive is that which exists in a way that it appears. So, in Tibetan, you use double negatives. In English, it sounds pretty weird, but the way that you express it in Tibetan is whatever is definitive, it is not, or it doesn't not exist in a way that it appears, which means that it exists in a way that it appears. So if it exists in a way that it appears, it means that it is a definitive meaning. So these two are posited in a relative way in relation to each other. And the Buddha, the Bhagavan, gave teachings on how to distinguish the two to different disciples of different dispositions. And since disciples had different dispositions, what is provisional meaning for one person can be taken as definitive meaning to another. So the way that we determine the provisional and definitive is through a path of reasoning, through a rational path. And this is the essence of good explanation that Lama Tsongkhapa gave in this text. And particularly, he used the reason of dependent origination as the main reason in order to make distinctions between what is provisional and what is definitive.
Tendil nenga che chigleya garson song jida kyarantu samya ngigo ikiris ani ngan tomba ni thyen xiaondi tomba ni thyen de ten la phewon ta zo ani jigbe lam jigbe toni ta ten la phawon dige namji number dungi gone ani cheche ni ani ten la phagoras namje number dungi gone mani ba cham to ba di tomani thyen to ba ya sha thu maris the siu shu song songs the shu nenga ra manzu namji ani tongba yimba di ani ji rang tongba yimba di namju number dengi rang ngun matba di rang ngun chumadu cheondi namju number dengi koni seni mani be toni juguyores chida inaya namju number dengi koni mani ba tsam toba di tomini thön toba la jogmari sonsons tuzu tole pe song nembu tangwet pe maseba kichim chagores di nenga ro di kalthug duslaundi jermuchigi ngenchon chanju samla komji ken sibi tsaw chebermini tise tender tobi tablan bevsati ro tenjong tablan bevsa dingi ngesam nenga chigba chigyang ya chagdu sangdus tine dangal di tolya ani gishi mugwes kan di tolya yangya ani tugsom sheba ani tende endelya ani suzu semla ya khoni ya yungro wasro.
You might be wondering, what is the main point that we are speaking of at the moment? Well, one point that came up in his honest teaching was the way to determine the view of emptiness, that definitive meaning, through a rational analysis, through a path of reasoning. And one of the methods that his honest mentions was the sevenfold rational analysis, in which you're trying to find the imputed object, and you see that the imputed object is not found using the sevenfold rational analysis. So then, does it mean that merely not finding the imputed object upon looking for it with the 7-point rational analysis is the meaning of emptiness? That is an important point that came up in his honest teaching, and his honest says that you should think that the mere not finding is not enough. There's something in addition that needs to be there in order to determine emptiness, which is an important point, because often we do say that emptiness, in the sense of emptiness of something existing independently, emptiness of independent existence, emptiness of that phenomenon existing from its own side, is what is determined through the sevenfold rational analysis, in which you look for that thing and you don't find it. So the mere not finding of it is the meaning of emptiness, as it is said. But then, as his honest said in his teaching, is that enough in order to determine emptiness? Said not. So then, thinking of it, what is a conclusion that can be drawn? If you look at, for example, the 3 principal aspects of the path and the instructions that Lama Tsongkhapa gave in this text, it says, therefore, in one of the verses pertaining to the view, it said, therefore, make effort in the view of dependent origination, dependent arising. Which means that Geshe thinks that this is the meaning of this section. So, using the sevenfold rational analysis, in which you look for something and you can find it, it's not enough to completely get the meaning of emptiness. You need also to combine that with the effort of ascertaining the view of dependent origination. Having said that, we will now go back to the text and pick up from the point that we left off in the previous session. Okay. Dilayandi krang antara nenga di tola gyawod de Shetuba Inasti, Dilalenchik.
The jail younger sound was wrong, jail at the chunju chance Sasamani name that Pichi Muntun and Drovana, and in chunju several level Kaptu Delia, and Tavi Cordi, and Pelotis Mans cap, and Chedan Jerumchi, chunju several level Tigati, Nengashu, Duchin, New Tolayovach, Yores, Ra, and the Zotan. Mother that you some shoji when sang it's new to Tony, any Naroji moderate to a cow shoot at us.
Paul is saying, can you please elaborate on this point which is honest is made? So we will get to that later on, Geshe feels, in the text, particularly in relation to the 9th chapter, which teaches in a very concise way the meaning of the view of emptiness. So we will get to talk about it later on. So Geshe wanted to go back to the section that we've covered in the previous week. And of the last thing that we covered was in relation to the commentary of verse 23. It says at the end of Geshe Dhamma commentary, pertaining to verse 23, therefore, if one were to get angry, then one should get angry at the afflictions and not at the person.
That the money chago restaurant, that the Kansana Nanzu Kansala Troya Gunsen to the Nanzulia no songs, never get songs. Ni Condro Sagoras, there are could Gunse Yanamena, Condro Sadan Rodi, Nalayan, Nudus, Nalayabuchi Mundu Seroj. The Tusa Zodi, Kansa di Nyumbi Shawan di Kurni Devare Madobi, Koran Rawan Yubi Tony, and Suchigaya Rawan Yubi Tony, Suchigaya Magawa Chimaras, Pena Rawan Yungi, Kansa Suyori, and Jasi Chanju Sembala Soba, Nyara Drajum, Jasi Chanju Samba Tenchik, and the Chorchun Jubitachi, and Sanji Power Didi, and Rawan Yoros, Di Nanolaya, and Condro Sading Chiamados, has in the Rawan Yuenza, Rangan Tony, and in Condro Sangi Suchi Yomaris. In the Kansa Condro Sangi, Condri Ongi, Nanzula, new getting in the two Satzawa di Condrola to the answer, and Nanzu Condro Sagina, Sagwasat, Condro Res, Mado, Kansat Maris.
In this section, it's saying, therefore, if one were to get angry, then one should get angry at the afflictions and not the persons. We normally get angry with another person in thinking that that person has harmed me. They do not treat me well. And therefore, it is justified to get angry at that person. So when we get angry at that person, we recognize that the person is acting under the control of the afflictions, and in that they lack independence. If a person would have independence, if they would be independent, would they get angry? Will they act in a way that is harmful to others if they have independence? Well, when we think of, in order to answer that, let's think of those who have gained a level of independence. Like, for example, Bodhisattvas, hearers and started to realize their ahas. The Buddhas of the 10 directions, they have gained independence from the afflictions. So do they act with anger? Do they respond to certain situations with anger? Since they do not become angry, it is indicative that anger arises for those that lack a sense of independence. So therefore, if there is something that you can get angry with, it is anger.
Tinzada Saji Koranawali, Niba Tron Deshindo, Keba Maimbanes, Tron Deshindo, Rang Tony, Country Keba Maimbanes. The part of never check out Sambi, nyumuda mutsunsu shenas. Cho chashi masam kyan kewa namni kina cho. Kewa chashi masam kyan cho tishin kewa gyurs.
That brings us to the next section, the next verse. We're looking at cultivating the patience that is intent on Dhamma. The extensive explanation began with, as both fury and the one who is furious, etc., rely upon causes that are not independent. And we're now covering the section of neither fury nor the furious person is independent. So after the point that we've just looked at in verse 23, the next verse, 24, comes under the heading of fury is not willingly developed. And in order to address that, first off, Yetta Dhammarinchen in his commentary comes up with an argument. Since the other person thinks I shall harm, it is not the same as with the afflictions.
Terida da sholuga jigdi choni dojiliya gogu yesares. Chowa chashi masam kyan kewa namni kina chose di kanzala jag. Kewa chashi masam kyan chowa di kewa gyuse di ani kyan la ya jar gores. Dima jana da niga chigwa la jabay na ani tsing hamma digi chanzang she sa gyu di chima digi yangya di koran she deba na da tsig dila ya gyugyon se di. Ani chadwa dindri mayimba chig di kanzala ji chig migwa la jabay na kyan la jar na ani jar chogores. Da jewe na dagaran roji lego res ra.
Kyan sana nyomong la jagarwa. So then looking at verse 24, it says, without thinking I shall be angry, people become angry with no resistance. And without thinking I shall produce, likewise anger itself is produced. So this verse can be divided into two sections. Without thinking I shall be angry, people become angry with no resistance. So these two lines are applied to persons. The following two lines are applied to what conditions those persons. Those persons are conditioned by the afflictions, right? So those two lines are referring to the afflictions. And without thinking I shall produce, likewise anger itself is produced. So it's important to make that distinction, that there are two parts of this verse, because otherwise if you read it in one go and do not think of which things this verse is referring to, it can get a bit muddled.
Chowa gyud namki keba chashi masam kya gyud sami keba namki kena ranga chowa kelas. Nyumu keba chashi masam kya chowa tejindu keba gyudi rangla rangwa mebi cheros. Yana che name kanzada chima nyumu ki kena shetos. Irida.
So as we said, the commentary began with putting forward an argument. Since the other person thinks I shall harm, it is not the same as with the afflictions. To answer that in drawing from this verse, although the causes do not think I shall generate anger, when the conditions are complete, then beings generate anger without any choice. Although afflictions do not think I shall generate, anger is generated likewise. They do not have any freedom of action. Otherwise, the first half can be related to the person and the second to the condition of the afflictions. When it says here, otherwise, you can say, moreover. Moreover, the first half can be related to the person and the second to the afflictions.
The sumba nyeba tada genlin jongwa rawa meba neis. Nyeba chinye tamje dan liba namban hatsoba. Tekin kengi tobli chung rawa yoba mainos.
That brings us to the next verse, 25, belonging to the same section of Neither fury nor the furious person is independent. As all wrongdoing arises from causes and conditions, it is without independence, in verse 25. That reads, all misdeeds there are, and all the various kinds of negativities arise through the force of conditions. They do not have self-power. In general, when we speak of phenomena which are under the control of others, we speak of compounded phenomena, for example, those which are under the control of causes and conditions. They are governed or controlled by causes and conditions, and therefore they are contingent or dependent phenomena.
There is that how do you never conducting by any Shaun Meba, King of Chonsabach, Chagors, Benatachi, Kondro Shuji, Kondri Namgur Doja Shuji, Dembainia, the Nyumbi Shawandu, Kurcheni, Shawangi Tony, Dembamado, Rawangi Korania, Rawangi Togi, and some Shendu, and Namjung but Denshawachi, Tawini, the Chagua Maras, Meditsambala, Surajiki, any Kundrin Namgur, Dugaj Tembaina, any Telea Castle, that's Yavator Moromachik. Tangwani judging Yamlin, Tangwani Figlia, just to show the Somanan Shinjin to some Shinji, Ninja Samsung Rochik, Lodge Key to go to us, that could be Kundutsa Kundri Wanki, that could lose Chagore, Ninja Samsung Matobi, and Yav Torzain, Tamuron's Chagores.
So not having independence and not having power, like for example, when you think of someone that is under the power of anger, they're showing anger, particularly when you come across someone that is livid, that is enraged. When you think of what you see, the behavior that they display, being livid, being so furious, it is not suitable to disregard that person. It is not suitable to discard that person because that person does not have self-power. You know, they don't think that now I shall become angry. Now I will act with anger. It's not that it is a deliberate attempt to become angry. The person does not have control, does not have power beyond the power of anger. And therefore, it is not suitable to disregard that person. A reasonable approach to that person is to have compassion to that person, to think, alas, so it is so pitiful. That person lacks power, lacks independence.
Redida Nevichari, that Divichari, the Kangalo, and King Toki, the Zawadi, Nanzuta, Dunga, Zawadi, Mariva in Somanashingi, and Mombi Wangi, independent control version, Mombi Wangi, and Yimidi Loki, and D Wangi Kondrosa, and a Kondru Wangi, that Lena Solo was sa, D Toki, that Dungan Yach. Or Dindichagora, since that Dungan Yonde Yongi Sukhayo Marasta, Devan Dungita, Dungan Mending is Motovigi, and Devan Yonde Mingita, Dungan Yonde Sukamevas, Menza, and Dindigi, the Rami Vitoni, Yonga Badi, Ribilam Jutugorestra.
So here we speak of the conditions, the faulty states that are conditioned by. They lack independence because they are conditioned by such faults, such as, for example, confusion, ignorance. Due to being controlled by ignorance, the mind is made unhappy when encountered certain situations. And when the mind becomes unhappy, anger follows suit. And under the power of anger, we perform various actions that result in suffering. So no one wants suffering. And when you then come across someone that is behaving under the power of anger in a variety of ways, you can think of the person that they do not want to have suffering. They want to be happy. There's not even a single individual that wants to suffer and that wishes for no happiness. You cannot find a person that wishes for no happiness and that only wants suffering. So that person that does not have control are controlled by ignorance, which gives rise to mental unhappiness, that then gives rise to anger, and under the power of anger, taking different actions that result in suffering. The person lacks power, lacks independence. So if you think about it like that, you can see that you're using a rational path in relation to that person. As this verse says, all misdeeds there are, and all the various kinds of negativities arise through the force of conditions. They do not have self-power. The commentary says in relation to that, all faults of afflictions that are found and the variety of negativities that arise from them also arise through the force of conditions and do not have independence. Similar to it not being suitable to get angry at water flowing downhill, thinking about these reasons stops anger.
아니 차담 무슨 간다지 끼기도 디나니 다지 아니 콘트로다 아니 데샤세로 소바 아니 샘리야 간다지 연구도 또 식대바이나 아니 통투야지 된 통바이나 아니 소수 재단디 콘트리 샤원디 켜니 데샤기 샤원디 켜니 아니 지 룽아기 남지 참을로 노르데바지 통바이나 지금 못 사야가 소리지 용사라서 아니 시파 아니 자르는 거야지 dimdi yung tu yosares the yung go was ra
Thinking of what Shantideva says here, we need to apply to our own mind. Think about how a mind is affected by those states. Do I have anger? How does anger arise in my mind? Am I affected by anger and attachment? So when you look at your own mind, then you see that I am affected by anger and attachment. I am under the control of anger and attachment. And because of that, my actions of body and speech becomes misdeeds. You become a bit embarrassed about your own activities controlled by anger, attachment, and so forth. And through that, you're starting to create a gap between you and your afflictive states of mind. And over time, the gap will be widened. You'll cast yourself further off from your own afflictive states of mind.
니바 대다기 규긴 라완제 마인 바네스 다 기부 베나타 란다신 수인 바이나 콘로사야디 비기려야 네버치야디 아니 콩주왕 송니 네버치기어 마도베기 아니 라완 토린다 아니 이치기어 마레스 다 아니 Shawang the Kursi shi Kongro Tian, and a King Toki Chungre Mado, some Shendu, Kongro Seva Mares. The Kongro King Toki Jonsagi, King Tian, and a Jawang Toki, and a Kongro Chungyo Mares. King Tian, and King Hatso Toki Chungre Mado, King di Ramayo Devaji, Ti Ramang Tony, and Keshaba, Benata Daki Sela Sobi, Hanin Yoras, that or Dindichavio Mares.
So then the second point in the section that explains both fury and one is who is furious, etc., rely on causes that are not independent, is the causes and conditions are also not independent in verse 26. So what are we saying in this verse? Well, when we think of ourselves, we think of others. When anger arises, and anger arises toward someone that is a harm doer, that harm doer is acting out of anger, and anger does not exist by its own power. The person is not harming others independently by their own power. They do that because they are conditioned by anger. But also when you look at anger, you can see that anger does not exist by its own power. It doesn't arise by its own power intentionally in thinking that now I shall arise. Anger is also a conditioned phenomenon. So anger arises due to various conditions. And when you inspect the conditions for anger, you'll also come that those conditions are conditioned by something else. Those conditions as well do not exist by their own power. They do not exist independently. So when we say that anger does not arise by its own power, the conditions for anger are not empowered by themselves. What we're refuting here is that they are produced by themselves or from themselves. So there's a certain terminology in relation to the philosophical view, which refers to a refutation of production from self. Right? So even if you're not familiar with that term, refutation of production from self, you can think about it in terms of anger or the conditions that give rise to anger. They're not produced from themselves. They do not arise from themselves. They're also conditioned by others.
Redinza, Tedaki Gigan Ramajan Mayaban, Ganum Soba Tedajan, Geva Chashi Sembame, Teji Tean Dagichi, Sembayoba Mayinos.
So this verse number 26 speaks of their causes and conditions are also not independent. Reading through this verse, it says, these conditions that assemble together have no intentions, I shall produce. And neither does that produced by them have the intention, I will be produced.
Then a new so do not give again Hatsopa, Tedakan, Dagi Dungan de Geva Chao she Semba Mela. They give you Dunga Dea, Di Da Gichi, Semba Yoba Maino. Then a part of it never Chava Samba, Gunzen the Chin, Choakiva Mirisos.
And it reads this, sorry, we read through the verse. Let's look at the commentary. Also, the accumulation of conditions that generates the sufferings does not have the thought, I shall generate these sufferings. And the generated sufferings also do not possess the thought, I was generated by them. Therefore, it is unsuitable to be angry at the other person based on the reason that the other person thinks I shall inflict harm.
The Taniba Ramanjin Yuba Gabala Sums, Jugen Ramanjin Maris, the Ramanjin Yuba Gabala Sum, Tanjin Big Datan, so Ramanjin Gabatan, Ribajin Big Da Ramanjin Gabatan. Drokun Trubata Shivachini, Chuamiri was, Tambo Tanjimi Dadan, Zu Rawanji, Gabalani, Zu Namgu, Rawan Keba Gabatan, Shiri Kevu Yula Rawan to launch of a Gabo. Tambo Zu Namgu Rawan Keba Gabanis.
Let's look at point B that comes under the extensive explanation of cultivating the patient studies intent on Dhamma, which is refuting the existence of independent causes. So we say that anger and the like are not phenomena that are powered by themselves, they are not independent phenomena. They depend upon cause and conditions. And here we are refuting the existence of independent causes. So there are three parts to that: refuting the independent self and principle of the Samkhyas, then refuting the independent self of the Nyayas. And the third point is, once one understands all migrators to be like emanations, they say that it is unreasonable to be furious with them. Beginning with refuting the independent self and principle of the Samkhyas, there are 2 points made in this section: refuting that the principle generates independent expressions, and refuting that an aware being autonomously experiences objects. Now, okay.
That there is that the Kabdulaya, so the Pena Kab Ted Titus Ra Pena Pavaya Singal Sobari, and it just Jim Shola, oh, Pibi Kabki, and the Tundam our Mambushuk, Yungers in a dinan so chile piggy, the do young in Tundamawa. Ani number main big nangi the two telaya ani tangent batang ani river chambala so to ani so chagyo sares ro ini the kunzugi tadushe ondi so the number down number main big tundamawe tadushe ondi and so the da jotang ton da ungun zindang toni ani keban drugyores kashi da rawanjeres kashi da round yomari da mebares the dinti ton and keban drug to us ra.
Looking in general at this outline, when we refute now the independent self and principle of the Samkhyas, and then refuting the independent self of the Nyayas, we're looking at certain philosophical views that were discussed by either the five great scholars, the father, which means to protect the Nagarjuna and his spiritual children, or, for example, the positions that were presented here in this treatise by Shantideva. When those positions are being presented here, they're presented from the viewpoint of different schools of thought. And often this presentation goes in the following way. You look at positions which are asserted by non-Buddhist schools, and you look at positions that are asserted by Buddhist schools, right? Which means outside the schools and our schools of thought. And when certain determinations are made with regards to the differences between those different schools of thought, they're made particularly with respect to the way that they posit the self. So some establish a self or positive self that is an independent self. They say that the self exists and it is an independent self. Other schools of thought say that the self is not independent. So first off here, we begin with two schools of thought, which are called the Samkhya school and the Nyayaka schools, both of which are non-Buddhist schools of thought, which have their own views about an existence of an independent self.
These are the number main big Tundamawe Nangolaya, and she's Mintumbatuma, she the Yobati Dilichagoras, and Nambi Nangolaya, and the Tundamawa she, the Chachine, the Umabalaya, Rangivan, Tangiva, Nispa Chevana, any Naxor Chachin, Kanji, or do Sini, any Dutsu, any the Mindamam Shuch layer was. In the Junjunaloma, Junjunaloya, the Tanjamba, any Rivachimba Gawandi, Cup Tea Tsigi, any Tanjambada, any Rivachimba Sogi, Karin Dewi Yabati, Tishisha Chini, any Kayabati, Sivuchagores. In a that, the Lora Mamu Shuch, Loton, Chikton, Fax, Rotsa Jelaya, and Koranzu Trimda di Penapandin Tangi Trimda Nanshingi, Mu Netsu Tony, then a pep to Medizambala, and Karin and Gyon Rusigras, Tandi Chalaya, and Konzu Jinju Watsugi, and Himananshingi, Lata Chivachi and Tolaya, dead 2 years Yomaras, Kanzano and Tambo Korani, and Jedandi, Mu Netsuda. 당한테 남산기 반은 단주를 시작해와나 아니 콘전 제수디 제수 뭐는지도 문팀비기 제수 차완자 디 제주 참으로 찍어지게 랍토야지 용 말아왔어 이내야 이내만 까온디기 디 튜기 아니 리버잼바당 아니 단잼바도 소비기 데술디 시샤 친 까고였어 디
First off, here Shantideva deals with the Samkhya school of thought and the Nyayaka school of thought, both of which are non-Buddhist schools of thought. And you can say that in general, while non-Buddhist schools of thought, of course, have different positions, you can also find some similarities between them. So first off, we have a refutation of some non-Buddhist schools of thought. Then looking at Buddhist schools of thought, we often speak of 4 schools of thought, 4 tenets. The last of which is the Madhyamika school of thought. The Madhyamika school of thought is divided into 2 sub-schools, the middle way autonomy school of thought and the middle way consequence school of thought, the Madhyamika Svatantrika and the Madhyamika Prasangika, which means that altogether you can say that there are even 5 schools of thought within Buddhist philosophy, and each one of them has their own position. So you come up with quite a big range of positions which are held by the 5 schools of thought within the Buddhist philosophy. But anyway, when you look at the refutation that Shantideva conducts here in verses 27 and 28, it becomes very clear that he refutes positions that are held by the Samkhya school and the Nyayaka school. I mean, it becomes clear, however, since such a long time has elapsed since Shantideva was alive and dealing with those positions, and up until now, for us, it could be really difficult to assess precisely what was the position that the Samkhya school was holding, or the Nyayakas were holding. At the time of Shantideva, it was, you could say, it is likely to have been more clear what the position was that was debated. Right? So you had, at that point in time, you had the Samkhya philosophers, Nyayaka philosophers, their positions were delineated in a precise way. So Shantideva addressed those positions and refuted them. And more than 1,000 years have gone since Shantideva has composed this text. So obviously, through the passage of time, a clear and precise understanding was somewhat more complicated to be found. And it is possible that even now we will have different ways of understanding what the position was of the Samkhya school, of the Nyayaka school. However, going back to the verses here, it is clear that first off, Shantideva refutes the position that was held by the Samkhya school of thought.
인자 당연히 디주기 총어도주기 아니 다주시장디 약 증문진 투나 가르라 팽그레스 나온디 아니 넘버 산지비 쇼기 아니 따와 땡종기 남자 라야 아니 고삼 제투야식 로 총아 손이 총에 가른 데버 여봐 디다 가르가른 가기도 가르가른 통금문도 야 심주 제사기 시지 여봐이나 아니 심주 제투야식 용거라서 빼는 간줄이야 도바지 여봐이나 도바디 또기 아니 도바 셀투야식 용거도 도바 카야 매봐이나 아니 지부지장 아니 간주지 아니 샘야지로 해매주지 용거도 어딘지로 차고라서 이내야 아니 되는 얘기 아 단다 아니 지 가서다 지버지마다 아니 단지마도 소비기 아니 숑라야 아니 단용메라 야구지 싱금에스 아니 니네마 칸송바디 아니 마 로샤지마도 텔야 아니 지버당치니 아니 사모지 군주따들 등이 싱금에스로
If you develop an understanding of dependent origination, you can use that as a basis of research in order to develop a greater and greater and more subtle and subtle understanding. The basis of your research is dependently arisen phenomena. And that research needs to be conducted with doubts, with questions. If you have a certain doubt that comes up in your mind, it gives you the opportunity to remove that doubt. Whereas if you have no doubts, no questions whatsoever, you don't have a good basis for making a progress. So having doubts, asking questions, checking, investigating is essential. So here we address the positions of the Samkhya and the Nyayaka schools of thought. So having said that, that investigation of dependently arisen, that investigation, of non-Buddhist schools of thought and positions that are held by Buddhist schools of thought helps you to develop a better understanding of dependently arisen phenomena, the view of dependent origination. Still, Geshe said that personally hasn't done an extensive study of the philosophical system of the Samkhyas and the Nyayakas, both of which are non-Buddhist schools of thought. So that being the case, Geshe says that is unable to give a really precise and detailed explanation of those positions, but we can still look at the way that Shantideva refuted those two schools of thought.
아니 총인 되버져서 조직 변다 당전받아 아니 리버진비기 되버져서 조직 아니 세만남지 완전 추적인 제비 아니 세만남지 레위니비 카툴이야 아니 덴시 난기 아니 담에 시비 카툴이야 아니 문지 빼망부치요레스 로 디치기요레 아니 군jen 라만잔 시비기 tumdachi musingi jore tesu inji tolayo meshiro da dindiro situ bana and tuzu devati gibuchin son yores.
However, if you want to develop a greater understanding of those different schools of thought, one thing that you can look at is Dhammakirti's commentary on Pramana. A text that he composed was the Pramana Vartika. And particularly in the second chapter of this text, the Pramana Vartika, he gave a presentation of the four truths. And in relation to that, he made quite a lot of distinctions with respect to the view of selflessness and the way that different schools of thought posit the self. So this is one source that you can look at. Another one, which is Geshe is not sure that it was fully translated into English, is the great presentation of tenets by Kunkin Jamyang Sheba. Dilayan manieba tsamsea di tsam manieba tsamsea di tundo kares ke chigido.
Nieba jobatra.
No.
Nieba jobat. Manieba tsam.
No. So earlier on, Victoria asked, what is the meaning of Mir Not Finding? Well, the word mir here is a negation of of just finding, right? So the mere not finding is, you can say, it eliminates finding.
다르다 젤니 마니바 다랑기 아니 다메 또발라 샤바이나 디기요 마레스 페나 니 조제 토라야 도제 파는 젤니 자님 니에요 마레스 니 조제 토라 디 마니바 장게 안 도제 파는 메바 타샤바이나 노르바라스라 이 소르지레스 지부지간 차고 말다.
So just to illustrate that using an analogy, and we need to keep in mind that the analogy doesn't apply in all aspects to the meaning, but it still gives you something to work with. So the position that Geshe was speaking of earlier on was that the mere not finding of something does not mean that you have understood emptiness, that you found the meaning of emptiness. To illustrate that using an analogy, if you look for a diamond on Geshe's table and you don't find it, the mere not finding of a diamond on his table is not sufficient to completely exclude the existence of diamonds. So if you don't find a diamond on Geshe's table, you cannot say that therefore diamonds do not exist. The mere not finding of diamonds is not tantamount to diamonds not existing. Thank you. So let's dedicate the virtue, I reckon. Lama Sangye Drupine Doa Chikyamalupa De Salakopashu Rinpoche Make Pama Kegyochi Kewa Nyamba Me Payam Kone Kondu Tawashu Kowe Shingon Pendan Dewa Malum Juwenye Chepe Siwa Tenzing Yatsoi Shape Site Patu Tengyuruchi Jamburn Gyawe Ten Zingron Bewe Kuntru Topoche Chosun Kowe Lemon Tundrupa Taso Duji Gonde Shaten Shushu Ani Tsobaki Kunda Chikjinda Chesti Kare Kunda Shiwatsu. So Geshe heard that the nuns community are going to sponsor a statue, right? So is it Shantarakshita?
Now it's Shantarakshita.
Now it's Shantarakshita.
And maybe some will pop on the baker's body.
Maybe the right arm.
Maybe the right
Yeah. 이제 시와서 아니 할람 로본 레든지 그래서 군다 말해 차상 레든지 차상 말해 그래서 테스트 프리즈 그래서 라파 차든 그래서 그래서
제데 안 베야고 총송스 좋아 걔는 저기 안 로디나로야 오늘 안에 저거기 터니 아니 슉슉 잡송스 좋아 가정에서 대박을 찍어서 더디 인견은 신들 공개 동서지 안에 저부터 아니 가정이 저거서 어디다 될 시원이 아니 먼저 공부권이 고야 문도 세도 지게지 니 tindirang labyo mardas nganju chego dos korang ya saranga re chungang re migi and karsa robi center odo sama lega pe mawu dos di komba di nganju gen le go dos lar ma da ko go mundu se di timares ya tinga jugo samu tan tindir labana kenza ji dos ra
So that's very good. Thank you very much. And also there were other things this year that the nuns community have worked hard on. So you made some offerings and donation to other things, $8,000 for this and that. So thank you very much. That's very good. Also, we have also said before that currently with the Gompa there was some discussion with respect to the Gompa manager. So Geshe's intention or idea was that not that we need to completely get rid of the Gompa manager position. It's rather that looking at the current situation with Sunny being the Gompa manager and then taking up an executive role and also being involved with the day-to-day running of the center, the well-being center, and so forth. He became so busy that it was difficult for him to do all the necessary jobs of the Gompa manager. So Geshe said before that if we were to take some of those responsibility, that would be excellent. But it didn't mean that to be that will take them forever, and therefore the position would be made non-existent. So anyway, Geshe just wanted to make that clarification.
아니 그러면 렉덴지 돌려 저는 제가 서지 로봇 지금 내 배시 군저 코랑 돌려 가지고 배셨던 지구로 차선스 다들이 슈트 소야다 직당나라 소버티 가지고 지구로 그랬어 아니 야고 배 총선스다.
Anyway, also saying that there will be also some money to cover some of the money of Bhaviveka statue, some of the funding for Bhaviveka. That's excellent. Thank you very much. It means that we have sufficient funds for all the statues. So on top of that, there are also expenses of freight, building the thrones and so forth. But Geshe reckons that also is being taken care of. So we're doing well.
And then I was given you sugar, Jilia, calling Kalishu Gabdishas. And then the Dilia, picnic chair, Segda, the Chonilia, Georgi Shindon Hotelia, and in Georgi Kovia Chandanji, the Fasho Cholia, Jimbuchin, and Tanzu, and Desak, Tamalo, Coranti Chetus, Kanjitelia. As a pinch yomar was maybe Tony, and then the Joseph yet some of the corner Ravani Tony, Rosoji Tilia, Richard Dog, Robert Cherochi, Condutrichedeshas, Kanjil, Sambanam Dacton, Ra, Sambanam Dacton, Chiganza, and Chuzon Dichet Chigoras, in Zangaransugi, and the Kanji, Nenatsamayoya, and Chi Chavalamdro, and Kanji Metzelhamati. 전당 데마직 토니 로토야 문음 자고야디 능한줄 랭게로스라 먼저 투야디 디얼 문음 자야디얼 능한줄 최고다 스티치로치스라.
And on top of that, Colin has been working on creating a nice sitting place under the Bodhi tree next to the statues. So he's been working on creating a bench and a picnic table, not only on one side, but also to extend it to the other side. He's working together with Richardo and I think that Pete has also been helping him out, and maybe a couple of other people. So that's very good. They're doing it with a great sense of concern and affection for the center. So also include them in your prayers. Wish them to have a long life free of obstacles, so that whatever they do will be successful.
And yesterday fixed.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. And yesterday they also fixed some panels that had termites. Wow.
The Javlo the Chictena Yavudos, the Javlo de la and a Tambulidine, Trush Quadishas, Lotus Tanda Korjoch, not Sibi Javlo, Mituziamandos Tondesach, the quality Tena Yavudos.
Okay. Chirola. Okay, there's also apparently another panel outside that needs to be pointed out to them. Do you know what Geshe is talking about? Okay. Anyway, we can probably go out and look it up, see what Geshe means. It says that there's maybe a missing part of the wall or whatever needs to be fixed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good. You had a
Yeah.
you had an operation. Everything went successful. Yeah. Even texted me last night and said that he's doing well. He's thanking everyone for saying prayers. So not only us, but also Rinpoche, Geshe, and so forth. So the operation has turned out very well, and it might go home in a couple of days. Sorry?
Yeah, totally. It can be.
Yeah, actually, kind of. He said that he had a conversation with the doctor who said that we just gave in to him bluntly. He says that his situation is serious. He might not survive it. Kind of without beating around the bush. So the operation was successful. And
My brother's best friend at school became a radiologist. Had 3 daughters. All X-rays he was taking, and one day he came home from work.
Oh, you're going to heal us.
And you're
yeah. Oh.
cuts.
Yeah, people do.
Yeah.
And I guess he didn't even know he had it.
Yeah.
Raphael's grandmother did that at a funeral. She just collapsed and died at the funeral.
Yeah, apparently if it bursts, then it's almost definitely game over. I mean, of course, the
Blood flow.
Yeah.
That's not huge.
yeah.
Very much.
I mean, I guess that you can have like a slight and massive.
My brother died from a dissected aneurysm, so he had a slow bleed.